President Trump is slapping a 50% tariff on copper imports. The announcement this week puts the metals sector back in the spotlight. Joining us now is Craig Hutchison, TD Cowen base metals equity research analyst. His coverage focuses on Canadian miners, and Canada is one of the top copper exporters to the U.S. Craig has highlighted a few names that could benefit from these Section 232 tariffs, including Capstone Copper, Hudbay Minerals, and Taseko Mines. Great to have you with us, Craig. And I'm wondering, given the new tariffs on Canadian products that are non-USMC compliant, and then you have the sectoral tariffs on copper as well, what is the ultimate tariff level? How should we be thinking about the copper coming from Canada?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. It's difficult to pin down right now. I think originally, I think that the thinking was going to be a 25% tariff on copper, and at the time, the spread between the LME, which is the main benchmark exchange, and the COMEX in the U.S. was around 10%. Now the threat is around 50%, but the spread between those two exchanges is closer to 25%. So I think, it's difficult to say how it'll all shape out, but I think, the market is sort of factoring in something less than 50% at the moment.
Okay, so even though Canada specifically has a Canadian tariff and then the sectoral tariffs, the market is still assuming less than 50%.
Yeah, I mean, it's a global market, so I think that's the way the market's thinking about it, just across the two exchanges. In Canada specifically, a lot of the producers in Canada aren't necessarily impacted by the tariffs. U.S. does import a fair bit of copper from Canada, but the producers that we cover, particularly those on the West Coast, actually ship all their concentrate over to China, where it's refined and smelted into copper, then often imported back into the United States. I mean, the U.S. right now consumes around 2 million tons of copper, and they only produce around 1 million tons. So they're obviously heavily reliant on imports from countries like Chile and Canada, and in fact are actually reliant on China in terms of refining capacity and smelting capacity.
In terms of the broader goal of the copper tariffs, and that is to bring production back to the U.S. and to spur that sort of investment, can we do that? I mean, it takes, 3 decades or so to bring a mine from discovery to actual commercial production. But China did invest a lot, and it accounted for a lot of the smelter growth in the past decade or so.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are other alternatives that are probably more effective than tariffs, to be quite honest. I mean, policy reform is something, I think it's a bipartisan effort in the United States. The U.S. is still reliant on the Mining Act of 1872, which is obviously very outdated in today's climate. We've seen very effective policy changes for other industries, trying to stimulate the wind and solar industries, nuclear, but providing tax credits, staffing up agencies like the EPA to make turnaround times for permits a lot faster. I think those policies would actually have a better impact in terms of stimulating U.S. production. Like you said, some projects take 2-3 decades to get permitted from discovery, and I think that's been probably the biggest factor in terms of stimulating the U.S. industry.
We highlighted some of the picks that you had in the sector, Craig, and I'm wondering, how those picks stack up to some of the U.S.-based miners and the other miners around the world.
Yeah, I mean, we don't cover it, but Freeport's probably the biggest beneficiary of the tariffs if they go ahead. Freeport produces around 1/3 of the U.S. copper, and they also have domestic smelting and refining capacity. So they would be able to, produce a refined product that could sell directly into COMEX. So they would get that tariff premium. Companies that we cover that I think would benefit would be, one is Hudbay Minerals. They have a good business in Canada and Peru in the copper business. They're also, trying to build a project in Arizona called Copper World. They're right now actively in discussions with partners. I think there'll be a lot of interest in that project, just given the fact that it's high grade, it's in Arizona, and they have the potential to produce a cathode. So they could be a beneficiary of these tariffs longer term. Taseko, more immediately, they have a project called Florence. It's in Florence, Arizona. They'll be producing cathode later this year and ramping up to next year. And so they would be able to capture that COMEX premium. And so we've seen some of these stocks have a really good run here in the last couple months on the back of the tariffs.